App servers with Migration Center. You know, that word upgrading is perhaps a bit of a misnomer here. The use of the Migration Center tool does not necessarily upgrade your Xen app servers. It's more like the fact that it, well, migrates them or migrates the metadata. And so when you're thinking about this tool and you're thinking about the processes you're going to have to go through, the Migration Center is not really concerned about the contents on your server, the actual applications that are installed and all the data on them, but instead all the Citrix related metadata that you use to define what those applications are inside of the App Center space. There is, as I've mentioned a number of times now, no direct upgrade path to version 6.5. And so really when you're ready to go to 6.5, you're going to have a lot of reboots that are going to be required in order to accomplish that. Important note here also is that, remember, we are on 2008 R2, which is that operating system of Microsoft's that's only available in x64. So, all right, if there's no upgrade path, and I've got to go through these rebuilds anyway, well, what in the heck is this Migration Center tool useful for? Well, in a small environment, you may only have a couple of apps and a couple of load balancing policies and maybe a folder or two. But as you start getting into the larger environments, or even just a mid-size environment, it's really this metadata stuff here that's of really kind of big importance. You don't want to have to go and recreate all the applications in your new environment. You don't want to have to make sure that you've got every little setting that's configured exactly correctly for all your policies so that the new environment behaves the same way as the old. So this Migration Center tool here is designed to allow you to migrate a number of different objects that exist inside of Citrix Xen app. Things like applications and folders and load evaluators, and policies and policy settings, and many of your server and farm configurations, and also the administrators that have access to do the various things inside of Xen app. Also, the health monitoring and recovery test configurations get migrated over, although the executables do not. And that makes a lot of sense. You know, the 6.5 is running on a different set or a different suite of enabling platform or enabling software and middleware. So the executables may be slightly different than what they needed to be back in 6.0. Notably, however, printer management settings and configuration logging settings are not migrated using this tool. So you are still going to have to bring over your printer settings. And be that as it may, that's still going to be a bit of an issue. I mean, there's still a number of different configurations that you have to make sure get mapped whenever you move over from the old version to the new. So Migration Center. At its core, this is a piece of technology that really is just a bunch of PowerShell commandlets. So even though there is a graphical UI skin, really what Migration Center is it's a series of PowerShell commandlets that you use to create a connection to an old environment, identify all the stuff in there, identify what you're interested in migrating over, and then, well, migrating it over. Now, the way in which you use this tool is, first and foremost, by creating yourself a Xen app 6.5 environment. Really, you want to, and there are a series of kind of edge cases where you don't necessarily have to do this, but for the most part, creating that Xen app 6.5 environment and then initiating all the migrations from that environment to your Xen app, for example, 6.0 or less, is kind of the way it works. So from here, this is where your little Migration Center piece is actually going to get connected up into. And from that location, it just kind of does its thing. And in fact, it's remarkably simple in the way that it works. And if all you're interested in is migrating the sum total of everything over, you're not really interested in really digging down into the individual pieces that you're interested in migrating, well, the graphical skin does things really, really well. I mean, as I'll show you here in a minute, it's actually very well designed in what it actually sends over. But if you do actually need to get into more granular control over what you're going to be migrating, well, you might think about actually constructing a couple of PowerShell commandlets or PowerShell commands in order to accomplish that. So in order to show you how this thing works, what we have here is our 6.5 environment. This is the Xen app 6.5 environment we've been using for the entirety of this series. And I have that app center, and I have my pre-launch environment. I've got the server XA Nugget 1. And then over on this other server, I have my old farm, which is a 6.0 environment. And brought back an old folder and our old friend calculator. We are on the server XA Nugget 3. I've got a load evaluator that's plugged in here, the default load evaluator. Even got a load balancing policy in here and an old worker group. Just a bunch of objects in here so that we can see what we're going to migrate over from the 6.0 world into the 6.5 world. Now, once these are, in this old environment, there's really not much you have to do here. Where all the juice really happens is inside of your 6.5 environment. Now, what you will see whenever you first start clicking around in the interface, under Administrative Tools and Citrix, is you'll see this Xen App Migration folder here with the Xen App Migration Center item and a couple of different PowerShell modules, more or less, that you can invoke as well. One of the things you'll notice, however, is if you try to run this right off the bat, and you don't have your execution policy set, your PowerShell execution policy set correctly, well, you're going to end up with an error message. So without getting into much detail about PowerShell and execution policies, if you play with PowerShell, you know what these are, and if you don't, well, just follow along. For this server, what needs to happen is I need to set the execution policy to the policy all signed, which effectively just says that any script that's going to execute has to be a signed script, or PowerShell is simply going to refuse to actually execute that script. So when I turn this on, that actually enables this Migration Center to work because, well, Migration Center is going to be using scripts, and those scripts happen to be signed thanks to Citrix, and I can make use of them right here. Now, when I launch Migration Center for the first time, the very first thing it's going to do is actually pop up this dialog box that says, okay, give me the source farm or a server in the source farm that you want me to pull the stuff from. Now, obviously, this has to be, a server that's, you want this to be close to wherever you're at. The server's got to be able to enumerate the stuff. When you have the correct source server in here, you can hit the check button here, and it'll ensure that you have indeed a server and indeed the right version, which in this case is 6.0. And once you're done with that, well, the only thing you really need to do is click the Analyze Farms button. Now, what it's doing is going out to the database on this remote server. And on that database are going to be contained all of the metadata configurations for that old environment. Now, as you can see here, well, I have, an application, my old calc. I have a folder. I have a group policy and a filter. I have a load balancing policy here. I even have a warning that says that there's no unique load evaluator that's been set for the my old worker group. I've got the default load evaluator, but not a unique one that's been created specific to this. A couple of changed objects in here as well. The unfiltered group policy. If I actually go about doing this migration, the contents of the old farm's unfiltered group policy could actually impact or will impact the unfiltered group policy here in the new farm, because there are settings in both. Same thing with the configuration and the load balancing filter and configuration here. So if you see everything here that you're interested in migrating, well, the only thing you really have to do is click the Migrate to Target Farm button, and it'll go about doing whatever it needs to do. For many of us, however, when we recognize the whole garbage in, garbage out concern that may occur when I want to just go take this aged existing farm and all the stuff that's in there and just migrate it directly over en masse. So there are a couple of different ways that you can approach this. The first, obviously, is to just simply remove the items out of the source farm before you attempt to use this tool. The second involves crafting yourself some PowerShell commands. And I'm not going to get into a lot of detail here because whatever commands you end up crafting will be specific to the needs that you have. But Citrix actually has a knowledge base article, or an edocs article here in edocs.citrix.com, titled Migrating Xen App Using the Command Line Interface. And I like this article better than the actual commandlet reference, because what it does is it gives you kind of the step-by-step in plain English process that you need to go through, the pseudocode, if you will, to initiate the connection, to identify the items that you want to manage or to migrate, to exclude the ones you specifically don't, and then to actually go about doing the migration. With this English language explanation, you can then go to the commandlet reference, which, in fact, if you look at the tree here, is actually just below this in the tree. You can go to that commandlet reference and get the exact commandlets you need with all the parameters that are necessary in order to craft whatever script you're going to use. Now, generally, the process kind of goes like this. First of all, we create a mapping to an old farm. Okay, I add that mapping, and then once I add that mapping, I need to set some of the options associated with that migration. So the remote server name, perhaps a non-default folder location, some object names to include or exclude from the migration. In there, I can also override specific values that I don't want. So this item here, the migration option, identifies the stuff that I want to migrate over, and this is kind of the inverse of that. Stuff that I don't necessarily want to migrate, or specific values that I don't want to migrate, the include followed by the exclude. Now, once that's done, the final step is to essentially start the migration. I have a parameter here called pending report only that'll just like we saw earlier with the graphical UI, it will give me a nice report and tell me what will actually happen. Handy to have. I might not have been aware that unfiltered policy over in the old environment was going to overwrite some of the settings in the new policy. So it's nice to have that what if scenario before I actually go about the final step, which is actually doing the migration. So that's really kind of it. Now you may be asking yourself, all right, well, this is all fine and dandy, but well, what do I do next? Well, the next process is then to generate yourself some new 6.5 servers. Because, as we said, there is no direct upgrade path between any of the previous versions and version 6.5. And so consequently, the last step in this process involves just generating yourself some of those new servers. And admittedly, I mean, if you're running on a Citrix platform at this point, and you have the streaming services already there, and you've got all the even if you're running Xen Desktop and you have the provisioning services stuff there, well, streaming down a new operating system and all the new applications, arguably, if you've done your upfront work, should be something that should be relatively simple to accomplish. So even though this migration solution doesn't actually do the migration for you, well, it kind of fits in with the existing solutions that Citrix has in place today. I will tell you, I'm not going to show you where it's at because I want you to, I would prefer you to completely rebuild your systems as opposed to removing Xen app and then reinstalling the new version. But Citrix does, for those that cannot do that, have a solution, a script solution that will actually go about going through all the processes of removing old versions and then adding the version 6.5. But the best practice is a rebuild. And I think we all kind of understand that at this point. So what have we talked about in this nugget? We've talked about very quickly just the things you need to be aware of when it comes time to get yourself on Xen app version 6.5. We talked about there not being a direct path, but the fact that the metadata in many ways is almost more important to get over than the actual applications themselves, because you don't want to make mistakes when you're out deploying those new application metadata and setting all of the individual configurations. You want to make sure that the new experience is equal to the old experience. We talked about how Migration Center is a series of PowerShell commandlets that have a graphical skin over the top if you prefer to use that for an I'm just going to migrate everything situation. Talked about some of the objects that can be migrated and some of the objects as well that cannot be migrated, and really just getting yourself prepared for what you need to know for getting yourself into this whole version 6.5 world. This takes us to the conclusion of this series. Once again, it has been an absolute joy to be able to work with you in bringing up your skills from the 6.0 world and into the 6.5 world, and also helping you with that new exam 1YO-A20. My name is Greg Shields. I look forward to working with you again in an upcoming CBT Nuggets series, but until then, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.